Welcome to PSR, People Speaking Rail. We are those people. I'm Mike Baudendistel, joined by Joanna Marsh. And Joanna, you interviewed TRAC Intermodal CEO Dan Walsh and wrote it up for the site. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I did. Yes. So TRAC Intermodal is a chassis provider, and so just wanted to get his thoughts on chassis availability. As you know, there was that big crunch in chassis availability. It's kind of during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, and just wanted to see how that market is looking like now. If there is still a capacity crunch, or can we breathe a sigh of relief, or is that how will demand for chassis look like in the future? So that's essentially what the Q&A is about. Please check it out.
Yeah, it's really a critical question. I hear from a lot of shippers that would like to use more intermodal. And, there's one more than one, shipper that we talked to on a regular basis that he had to go back and forth between using either more intermodal or less intermodal the last few years. Now they're using a little bit more intermodal because the rail service has gotten better. They used a little less the past couple of years. There was one CPG company specifically that you had to go into some of these rail terminals in Chicago, pull their containers out of the rail terminals, put them on the highway because the service was that bad going back, a year or two. And now they're using more intermodal. We also hear from other companies that look to use more intermodal, but the service has to be consistent. So they would use it, for instance, from the port of New York, New Jersey into Chicago, which can go on the highway in 2 days. Whereas intermodal, if it was 3 days every time on the dot, they'd use intermodal all day long, but they don't have that degree of reliability. So a big part of that is having the equipment in place. And so you asked Dan about that. There were some interesting things that I took away from your article. And you asked him if a chassis shortage could happen again, like you had in 2021. And he pointed to kind of the bullwhip effect, how it was so unusual. The market was so unusual, where you had constraints with getting imports, and then you had the huge surge in imports, and sort of that those market conditions created, at least contributed to a large degree of the congestion, combined with not having enough, labor availability at things like warehouses to unload and unload the containers. So it was kind of the perfect storm of market conditions. But then they said, sort of in addition to the market conditions, the other reason why those market conditions may never repeat, and so that's why you might never have a chassis shortage to that degree. But then in addition, the company's made a tremendous amount of investments, adding new chassis, upgrading those chassis, refurbishing them, et cetera. So a combination of those two things, which hopefully we don't have that type of congestion again.
Yeah, and he had also mentioned some other points too about e-commerce, not necessarily going away, even though you haven't heard as much about it because of
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
is there a what do you call it, with consumer spending? Is there more hesitation in buying patterns? But that's not to
Mhm.
say that that's for better for worse. That's a
Mhm. Mhm.
a long term sort of hesitation. So yeah, you think about if e-commerce isn't going away, but in fact will continue to evolve, and consumers will continue to demand that sort of um, that quickness in deliveries. Like how does that, of course,
Mhm.
affect um, uh, intermodal and chassis availability there. So that's, I guess, the other factor, in addition to the investments that TRAC Intermodal and other like companies make with their assets.
Yeah, that's one of the questions I get is how does e-commerce impact intermodal? And you hear from some people think it's a negative for intermodal because e-commerce demanding those goods so quickly, you need sort of the high service levels associated with truck, and you get more of those goods close to where the consumer centers are, so even closer than they would be at sort of a regional distribution center. Is more like a local fulfillment center to get it to you same day or within a few days. But I think overall, it's sort of more e-commerce. A lot of that stuff is kind of impulsive spending, so at least the more consumption overall. You do have to consider that UPS is the single biggest intermodal customer. So the growth with e-commerce contributes to their volume. A lot of Amazon packages move intermodally too. So to a large extent, I mean, those companies are trying to get those goods in place, anticipating what consumers spend before they spend it. So just the fact that it ultimately is in a fulfillment center that's within a couple miles of my house, I order it, I get it in an hour or two. It took a long, it was a long way to get there, and still may have moved intermodal, even if it wasn't the final mile. So I think that was a good point. He also had some interesting thoughts on just the overall intermodal market. And I'm going to talk about a few highlights here. So he says he expects an 8% increase in intermodal volume from your article from the first half of 2023 to the first half of 2024. So when you sort of bring up a sonar chart of international intermodal volume, you can sort of see why that is, where you see the white line in 2023. So it really sort of started the year off pretty depressed. And a large part of that was 2022. You had fall off in international intermodal volume. These are basically 40-foot containers, 20-foot containers that were loaded. You sort of declined throughout last year because of the fall in imports. A lot of that translated to depressed international intermodal volume. So he's saying, expecting that to rebound some next year, 8% increase, and that 8% increase could be even stronger in the second half of 2023. So, so they're sort of anticipating, some degree of rebound. And they talk about how they've spent north of $1 billion in recent years to get the equipment in place, which is not only buying new chassis, but there's a lot that can be done as far as upgrading and refurbishing, old chassis, adding things like safety features, having the right, tires, all of those things, having those in place. And so expecting near term, he's reasonably bullish on next year. And then looking out longer term, there were some interesting comments on that too. So, he believes still that intermodal is a GDP plus grower. And so if you sort of look at the GDP outlook as being compound annual growth of, let's say, 1.7 to 1.8%. So not a tremendous amount of economic growth, but he thinks that intermodal will grow something more like 3% a year, sort of cites how historically from, let's say, 2000 to 2020 grew about twice the GDP growth rate, even though in the last few years that outperformance has sort of slowed down. And I thought those were interesting comments. And actually I've heard that, I guess, more of the people that we've had on this show still tend to view intermodal as a growth area.
Yeah, I mean, it's just interesting just how it just. Well, I mean, this sounds like the obvious comment of the week, maybe, but that just how it just kind of cycles up and down. And I'm just thinking about just a few years ago about sort of intermodal sort of being the next the savior of, of rail volumes, and then of course right after that was that Jake's, and then you have it rail volumes all together and intermodal. But I mean, I guess you kind of harkening back to what we were talking about last week with all the intermodal related partnerships that the Class 1 railroads have. You had mentioned, of course, BNSF's project in the Western U.S. And then was it now like Norfolk Southern and well, yeah, between Norfolk Southern and BNSF, or sorry, Norfolk Southern and Union Pacific and CSX and CN. So all of those Class 1 railroads are announced those various partnerships last week, and that itself shows that they see some future in intermodal, if not necessarily for this year, then sometime over the course of next year or however long.
Yeah, we have a sonar chart that speaks to the competitive nature between truckload and intermodal volume. And so what we have here is domestic intermodal volume, loaded containers in green from a company that processes the waybill. So it looks like kind of a flat line, but it's not so flat. It's sort of with the scale there. And then you're comparing this to long haul outbound tender volume index. So those are requests to move loads. Those could be accepted or rejected. So it's not completely apples to apples, whereas the green line is loads that were actually moved. So the tightness in the market, in the truckload market from late 2020 to early 2022 amplifies that white line demand for long haul movements on the highway. Nevertheless, you do see how starting in late 2022 to late 2020, it appeared that the truckload market took share from intermodal volume. You saw the heightened long haul up on tender volume index to find that as being over 800 miles, and sort of that period of tightness there from late 2020 through 2021 really represented truckload taking share. It seems like every time we go through a period of truckload tightness, we say, well, intermodal missed this great opportunity to take all this share and be sort of the relief valve in the transportation network. That never seems to really materialize. But I think the good news for intermodal, it does seem to have gained, at least some of that share back here lately, and those lines seem to be more in line, here in 2023. Sort of suggests maybe we're starting to get service levels that are better. I've heard that from a few, CPG companies. And then, this latest surge in, if you want to call it a surge, in early fall, more of that's gone to truckload. So you see sort of overall, you kind of look at that and say, well, intermodal hasn't done any better in total than truckload has. But maybe that changes going forward. I want to move on to another article that I think is really important. I want to highlight was written by Greg Miller, and he's talking about exporters, which I think anyone who is involved in the rail carload business, and especially on the export side, will want to read this article. And it really sort of draws this contrast between the export market on the ocean and the import market on the ocean. I mean, we tend to focus more on imports. There you can see a picture of Greg's article, which is up on the site. And for exports, container shipping still far from what we think of as being the pre-COVID normal. Talking about how container rates for U.S. imports have normalized while exports have not. Have a sonar chart that speaks to that. And so what you see here, this is the Drury World Container Index. On the left is Shanghai to Los Angeles, so imports. And then on the right, we have reverse of that, LA to Shanghai. You see on the left how rates, and these are spot rates, have basically gone a round trip from the pre-COVID levels, which is about, let's call it in round numbers, 2,000 per 40-foot equivalent unit, went all the way up to peak of 13,000. I've gone back to 2,000. And then on the right, you see these are the export rates on the ocean from LA to Shanghai. Went from about 500 all the way up to 1,500, back to 839. So still far more expensive to move containers into the U.S. than to export them from the U.S., which makes sense. U.S. big. We import a lot more than we export. A lot of those containers that move outbound are empty. Greg said in his article about 39% of the containers moving outbound are loaded, and the rest are empty. And then what's interesting also is he goes on to say, well, those rates, are so you have a similar pattern on the contract side. He has some data in there from Zanetta, which shows the contract rates. Similar pattern, still elevated for exports, and then goes on to say, well, the rates are an issue for exporters, but they're not even the biggest issue. The issue that's bigger than that is related to things like detention, demurrage charges, all those accessorials, and then just poor service levels. And so, exporters of things like, grain, bulk products, there's a lot of scrap, waste paper, those type of sort of lower value items are what tends to be exported. I think those exporters are having a harder time, which is all related to an article that you wrote up recently on grain exports and how those are depressed. Have a sonar chart on that. And what were the big reasons for that? Again, I think there were a few reasons: global market conditions for some of those commodities. Is that right?
Yeah. Just I mean, the carloads will pick up, with the fall and winter here, but Argentina and Brazil, for instance, have been like really viable rivals, for exporting soybeans. And then, of course, you have the Black Sea region in Europe for wheat exports. And so there's just, even though, let's see, I guess even though those aren't necessarily, brand new competitors, they've been around for a while. I think just the the increase in volumes that they've had there, just the success that they've had in those regions, just makes for more competition for U.S.
Mhm.
grain. So that was one of the big factors, kind of looking on. And then I think the other one is um, the domestic production of biofuels. I mean, you have, of course,
Mhm.
more corn going to to domestic ethanol production, but then you have an anticipated increase in production for biodiesel. So what does that mean for oil seeds that will be not be going to export, but will rather be going to domestic plants.
Yeah, it does seem like it's going to be a hard, quarter for the railroads when they report next month. I think the volumes have not surprised anyone to the upside. I thought Union Pacific really was sort of guiding down numbers at the analyst meeting last week, largely due to volume. Intermodal volume has been weaker than expected, and even some of those bulk volumes, like we were showing, weaker than expected. I want to move on to another article that you wrote. Union calls for safety review after unfortunate death of a CSX carman. There's an article that you wrote up on the site. What happened with this?
Sure. So on Sunday, there was a carman. He had 19 years of experience. So not a new employee. And unfortunately, there was an incident involving remote controlled locomotives. This is according to the union that he was a part of, the Brotherhood of Railway Carmen, which is affiliated with the Transportation Communications Union. Um, and so, he sustained injuries and unfortunately succumbed to them. So that's what's happening. NTSB had tweeted that they were sending an investigator or investigators to look into the circumstances surrounding the incident. Of course, CSX and the unions. Well, obviously, CSX is going to be involved. Typically, the unions are involved in this kinds of investigations as well. So that's kind of where things are. But it was interesting though because the union leaders, one of them had suggested that this is the first incident involving remote controlled locomotives. I'm not entirely sure when the other incidents involving remote controlled locomotives occurred, but still, the union leader was saying, this is something that the rail industry needs to look at, not necessarily saying calling for regulation per se, although I think in general, I think the unions want to see some rail safety regulations passed, whether through Congress or other means. But it's something that the industry should look at. I to be honest, I don't know how much of remote control, language related to remote control locomotives, how much of that was in the rail safety bill. I
Mhm.
probably not address so much, but I don't don't take my word for that. It was actually more other elements I think they were looking at, like wayside detectors and of course the train crew size.
Yeah, I think that's
But
right. I
yeah.
mean, I think that was really sort of it was focused on things that led to that Norfolk Southern derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. When you think of the remote control locomotives, those are just used in the yards,
Mhm.
and it's something that enhances the efficiency of the yard operations. You don't have to get someone doesn't have to go into the locomotive. They can use that remote control pack. They showed us how to do that one time at a analyst day. You could control the locomotive, have it go back and forth a few feet in neat technology. I mean, you think the unions wouldn't like that just because it reduces the overall number of employees, and you can use your employees more efficiently if you can use those yard locomotives via remote control. But yeah, another unfortunate incident. That union referenced that this was the third fatality. I don't think we know when those other two that they were referencing were. I don't think they were talking about the two CSX trainees that died
Yeah.
in Maryland, a separate instance. They were talking about specifically because of the remote controls. You don't know whether that was, those were recent or not. So,
Yeah,
um,
yeah, that's something.
mhm.
Yeah, it's something I need to
So,
work on. But yeah, but unfortunately as well. I mean, you're right that unrelated to yard operations. Well, no, I should take that back. But unrelated to um, remote controlled locomotive operations. You had that incident with the two conductor trainees at CSX. Happened, I think, like June or July, and then another in August, or like with pretty within several weeks of each other. So and then CSX had called the conductor trainees back for more training, and then you also have CSX and the union representing train conductors, kind of coordinating on training. Um, but
mhm.
yeah, it's rail safety, even though um, there hasn't been much movement within Congress over that rail safety bill. It's still, I think, a topic that the unions don't, understandably, don't want to fade. Want to keep that issue in the spotlight.
Absolutely. I want to move on to a lighter topic, and at least I think it's a lighter topic. It was an article that Eric Kulish wrote. So here we have a picture of an airplane. We're talking about airplanes on people speaking rail, and there's good reason for that because BNSF compels this new airline, so startup, to change its name in a trademark dispute. So this was Northern Pacific Airways is going to rebrand as New Pacific Airlines after a trade dispute with BNSF. How is this a trade dispute? Well, turns out that we know the Class One railroads are the result of many mergers over the decades, and Northern Pacific, before it acquired Southern Pacific, became or not Southern Pacific, but acquired Santa Fe, become BNSF. Northern Pacific merged with three other railroads to form Burlington Northern in 1970. And so Northern Pacific is a legacy Class One railroad name, even if it hadn't used the name since 1970. So I guess if you're a history aficionado, you would know the name Northern Pacific. I didn't know the name Northern Pacific. It's a little hard for me to imagine someone confusing an airline with a railroad, but I guess that's the rationale that Eric cites in the article. The U.S. Patent Office rejected the registration of the Northern Pacific Airways name because of likely confusion with BNSF's brand, according to court documents. It's I find that hard to believe that someone could confuse those two things, confuse a startup airline with a railroad name from 1970. I can understand why someone could confuse BNSF Railroad with BNSF Logistics, the arm that was just acquired by JB Hunt. But do you have any thoughts on this one?
But actually, it just reminded me just now of uh, one of the things about the rail industry, and I say this in an endearing kind of way, is that people do love their history. I mean, you do talk not necessarily with rail buffs or like historians, but even just for people who worked in the industry for a good time, and
Mhm.
they'll refer to things that happened in the 60s and the 50s and the 70s, and it's like, of course, don't you know this? So that's so it is something that the industry tends to do, and perhaps it's simplistically a sort of a culture clash, so to speak. The industry has a very long memory, and even though it happened 50 years ago, it's still very much in the collective minds of people. So maybe the Northern Pacific thing, that's why. Um, yeah.
Yeah.
That's
I'll have to
that's
go
necessarily
back
good.
and
That's kind of I just thought of it. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll have to go back on FreightWaves now and see if Eric had a similar take as I did. I'm sure he probably was on at least one time this past week to talk about it. So last 10 seconds, what are you working on in the next few days?
yeah, so there's a lawsuit that Progress Rail, which is I believe a Caterpillar subsidiary.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, they produce locomotives, and there's an ongoing lawsuit. They actually filed it in like early September, but it's against Wabtec, and sort of saying that Wabtec
Hmm.
um, has the way that it's played the market is sort of as an anti, sort of kind of edging out all the competition. Just kind of looking at Progress's statement, and also Wabtec released a statement on the lawsuit. So that's ongoing, and so that's um, something we're working on.
I mean, they really are most of the market in locomotives, right? I mean, they're kind of the market in locomotives, but part of that's because their technology won out over Progress Rail's technology. Used to be Caterpillar's technology, and that's part of why there's been so much interest in that stock. When I was a stock analyst, I probably got more questions on Wabtec than any other stock that I covered. But so definitely look
Yeah,
forward to that and plan on
yeah,
talking about that
yeah,
next week.
yeah, for sure, yeah.
Okay, with that, hope everyone has a great day. Go sign up for our Rail newsletter, which can be found at the bottom of any of our Rail articles, and talk to everyone next week.